It's indeed my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our special guest speaker. He actually doesn't really need an introduction, he's so well known, and looking through his achievements, he should be at least a centenarian, 100 years old. But I'll just read, I'm going to speak fast because it's just amazing. Rob has enjoyed an extensive career within the financial services industry. He acted as both Chief Executive Officer of St George Bank and Managing Director of BankSA. Rob is Chairman of the Adelaide Airport, T-Ports, Barossa Infrastructure, ZeroCo, Fusetec and Golf Ltd. He's also Executive Chairman of Chapman Capital Partners and Director of Cooper's Brewery. AFL Max, Expert Finance Australia, and Rob, as we all know, has been the past chairman of the Adelaide Football Club. And as the chairman, he had an incredible influence in what happened not only with that club, but this whole state. Actually moving and having the facilities we have today have a lot to do with that board. He also was part of the form of the WAFL, the Crows here. He was also the chairman of BankSA, president of the Business SA and CEDA. So that Rob is also a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, senior fellow of Financial Services Institute of Australia, and holds a Diploma of Business from the South Australian Institute of Technology. He's also, more importantly, been recognised for his consistent pursuit of excellence and the astounding contribution to South Australia in 2005 with a great award for business. But on top of that, speaking to his friends and people that know him, he's known as a great bloke and also an extremely proud South Australian. So I'd love you to give a warm Adelaide Rotary Club welcome to Rob Chapman.
Thank you, Danny. You forgot good fishermen too. I just put this down. Got a tickle in my throat. It's not for any other reason. Been drinking Cooper's Pale Ale since I was 18. Very medicinal. Delighted to be invited to come and talk to you all today. I consider it a privilege. Loved listening to you, Frank, and that specific Aboriginal Preventing Chronic Disease program, much needed, and the contribution that this Rotary Club will make to that should be applauded. Rotary, I think this is the second biggest club in South Australia, been going on for over 100 years, and it's credit to every person involved, past and present here, so well done to you all. I know firsthand what it does. My wife actually is the Australian representative of a little international charity called Kids for Kids, which provides much needed support for children and families in Darfur, in Sudan, a country the world has forgotten about. It's lawlessness, and there are people getting killed every day, and this little charity does what it can to provide support, medicine, the basics, Phil, that we all take for granted, and it touched our hearts, and she does what she can. And the only reason I mention that is because the Crow's Nest Rotary Club reached out literally in recent days to see what they could do to assist. So I thought I'd just mention that for what it's worth. President Cam has asked me to talk about leadership and leadership in amongst crises. I have a library to choose from, James. I've narrowed it down to 4. I'll take one from each of a couple of the industries I work in. As was alluded to, I was so lucky to start my career in financial services, and Jeff Tate, the centurion down there, gave me my first job. He said he retired 37 years ago. That means I started work about 38 years ago. Just a really, really quick story. This was in the early 80s. I'd just graduated. Unemployment was running at 10%. I used to hand write 10 applications a day to jobs, and you had to wait for the advertiser to come out on a Thursday to see who was advertising. 6 months, no reply, 10 a day, Alfredo. Hey, how times have changed. I sent off an application to City Mutual Life. Jeff was the esteemed state manager, and the job title was Manager Superannuation. And I'd just studied business, so I considered myself a manager at 19 and a half. So I duly wrote in. I don't know how I got an interview, but I got an interview, and I promise you, when I was 19, I looked like I was 13. So I walked into the office this day. Manager superannuation. Prior to getting there, I didn't even know what superannuation was, so I asked the most intelligent person in my circle of friends, which was my grandfather, and he articulated a narrative around superannuation using big words, and I thought, that's wonderful, I'll memorise that. I was asked, okay, young fella, and he's sort of looking at me, looking at the application, trying to match up why I was here for a manager superannuation job. He said, tell me about superannuation. So I told him exactly what health insurance was and the need for it. That's exactly what he did. He laughed and he said, listen, young fella, there's a clerical job going down the back near the kitchen. Go down and see Tony Williams, Bruce. And this is how fortuitous, sliding doors. I went down to meet this Tony Williams, who was 10 years older than me, and there was this basic clerical job in superannuation, and he looked at me and he goes, do you play footy? And I said, yes. He said, we stood each other last week. He played for Gazer. Denny, I was a Sacred Heart boy, you know, that AFL machine that produces AFL footballers year in, year out. And we stood each other, and I got the job because of that. And it was the only interview I've ever been for, but how lucky. So, Jeff, I owe you my career for what it's worth. So, crises. I mean, crises, personal crises, family crises, industry crises, national, global. We've all been through them, all experienced them. I think today, as a society, as a business, as a state, as a country, we try and prepare as best we can for any eventuality, whatever that may look like. We all do risk registers. We all have risk appetites. We understand the risks, and we spend a lot of our time and resource and effort trying to mitigate those in the eventuation, or if any of these scenarios played out. But there's been a couple in my time that you couldn't have planned for. The most recent one was the COVID pandemic. And let me tell you, aviation was possibly the most affected career. Tourism, Bill, right? Shut it down. I'm not sure who had COVID or a pandemic in their risk register. Put your hand up if you did. As an airport, we'd considered it. And the beauty, I love chairing our airport because we have a big cohort of people around the world that run airports, and there's a lot of information sharing, and we were probably a little bit ahead of the curve than society. But down at Adelaide Airport, we were just about to embark on our most recent upgrade. We were spending $200 million putting in a new tarmac, putting in new exits, and also the whole retail presence that you're seeing. And also, more recently, a new conveyor belt for the international travellers. It looks good. We've won the best airport in Australasia and the Pacific for the last 3 or 4 years. Fortuitous that we did that then and made the decision then, because you couldn't start that during a pandemic. Therefore, other airports haven't been able to do that. So we got ahead of the curve. Why am I telling you that story as a crisis? We, as Adelaide Airport, were better prepared because I, as a banker, had gone through a global financial crisis. and I knew the power of a strong balance sheet, cash, king, and it was just so critical in our decisions leading up to and during the pandemic. So when this scenario eventually hit, Mark Young at the time, Managing Director of the airport, he had his team together. This is a time where you can't over-communicate. And they were in crisis mode. They would have meetings regularly. They had a set agenda. They had to go through everything on that agenda to mitigate the risk. We had to come out of this the other side, and there are airports around the world that didn't, and there's certainly airlines around the world that didn't. So the message in that for me, Cam, was the learnings, making sure you can plan for it to the extent that you can, having remedies in place or at your disposal to implement when a pandemic hit, and we were able to having a strong balance sheet, and we're able to come through that at the other end. I mentioned the GFC. I was running a bank at the time. It was very scary. I'm not sure the world truly understands how close we came to a much greater calamity than what actually played out. It was a time where there were so many different investment vehicles and types and documentation that supported each and every one of those investment types. And I fear to say that there will be some boards around the world that signed off on these deals without actually knowing what they were. And the merry-go-round, I'm giving you the simple version here, went around and around, and at some stage the music stopped and you had what you had, and it started to unravel. The big investment banks around the world, remember the term too big to fail? This is where this was coined, and there's been lots of discussion since about government roles and banking roles in the world. But it was the big banks that actually led the recovery, and they set up shop in I can't remember whether it was the White House or the Pentagon or somewhere like that, but they were the ones that took control of the agenda to work out what had happened and, more importantly, what the world was going to do about it. A lot of learnings out of this, and I think we are in a much safer environment than what we were entering into a GFC. But because of the GFC, there are a lot of people, if you're looking for directors on boards these days, get someone that was involved in risk mitigation that went through a GFC and all the learnings that were attached to it, and get them on your board because they can safeguard you a lot. Giving you the much abridged version because I'm told we're very, very strict here re-timing. So a global financial crisis couldn't really predict. Certainly a pandemic was less predictable, just hit you. I was walking in with Brenton here, who just said he walked past where's Brenton? Right in front of me. He said he walked past the Phil Walsh tree that we planted just outside of Adelaide Oval. Well, if you couldn't predict a pandemic, you couldn't predict the murder of your very own football coach. So sort of bringing this down now from a global level to, from pandemics, global financial crisis, to something that sort of hit home at a very much a local level. But it impacted not just our football club, it impacted a state, it impacted the whole football nation, actually impacted people around the world. You can't prepare for that. And I will never ever forget the time where I was, what was said when I got that phone call at 3:13 in the morning from the Assistant Police Commissioner. Learnings from that crisis, take control. We needed a leader. I'm a big believer that the chairman is the chairman. The chairman is the first among equals that sits around a board table. But remember, management run companies. Management run the footy club. I used to say that at lengths. Management run companies. But every now and then the chair should step up, and it should be maybe once in his or her term, but this was the time where I took control, and with Andrew Fagan, who was a very new CEO, sat in the dark in our boardroom at West Lakes still and had to work out what we were going to do. I can remember saying to the Assistant Police Commissioner, how much time do I have before this breaks? She said, the media are here. You get that? The media are here. So she said, I think I can buy you a couple of hours. So we sat there. The first thing that went through our head was, right, who do we need to inform? We just decided then that communication was paramount. Communication. We can't over-communicate. Favourite saying of mine. And then as we were going through that communication phase, we worked out, gee whiz, there's going to be a lot of people today that are going to need a lot of care. So it was care and communication became our themes for the day, probably for the week, months, and to this day. So we went through the communication, and it's a process. And my bank training probably came to the fore. I don't want to sound like this was driven by me, but the banks, big companies, because of their resource, train you really well. And big banks are prepared for all of these scenarios right here today better than they've ever been before. And that's why we got risk statements, risk appetites, all of these things which are sometimes frustrating to deal with around a board table, but that's why they exist for this once every 10 years, 20 years generation thing. So we sat there, we worked out, and I won't go through the list again for expedience of time, but who we had to contact, who needed to be here now. We got our senior players in, we got our board in, we got our media and communications people in, we spoke to the AFL, we spoke to other clubs, we spoke to the government, we spoke to every single one of our stakeholders, sponsors, but it was all on the whiteboard, and this is the training that kicked in. We just ganted that out, and then we allocated task. Don't try and do it all. So we had the team sit around, and we worked out who was in the best position, who had the best skill, what's the best use of this person's time to deal with the task at hand. Still 5 o'clock in the morning at this stage. So starting to get people come in. Then the media starting to front on our doorstep, and we're starting to get the phone calls. So we started to make notes, and we started to work out what having identified communication was key, what are we now going to say? And sometimes we're all guarded in what we say. Football's guarded in what it says. Not because you want to be secret most of the time, it's just guarded in your own IP or something. Governments are the same, businesses are the same. We just made the decision there and then. We're going to be talking to a pretty big audience here. We're just going to tell everybody everything we know, and we'll take everybody on this horrible journey with us. And we fronted the cameras, and I can remember I had literally pages of notes, and I can remember screwing them up on the way down. We just jumped into the club polo, we raided the merchandise shop. I was a bit harder to fit than Fags, who was an elite athlete, but we fronted the cameras and we literally just sat there. I think it was the longest ever recorded press conference like in our history, but we just went through it. Said, I don't have all the answers, but we'll tell you what we know, and we went through it factually. And then we got question after question. We put our hand up when we didn't know. We gave an assurance that we would tell people when we did know. So communication was the lesson out of that. Being organised, being prepared, going through it logically, and telling people what they needed to hear. And I can't emphasise that enough as a learning. Probably the other thing in that is get people around you that have had the experience of going through a crisis. And I'm now a person, Andrew's now a person, and other people that have gone through pandemics and global become now experts that get engaged when companies or sporting clubs or governments have a crisis, because that experience you can't replace. You know the cycle, this is GFCs, they come around every 15 or 20 or 25 years. It's because we change our behaviour after one of those. for a period. Then the people that went through it leave and depart over time, and the new brigade come in, and then expectations are created, and shareholders have expectations, and the pimply-faced analysts that, criticise the experienced people that run these organisations want to know about earnings next month, next quarter, let alone 5 years down the track. So the pressure builds up again until all of that corporate history is lost, and we repeat the mistakes of, the previous generation. Does that make sense? So never lose it is the other lesson. So have this library have these scenarios. And I think businesses that I'm involved with, businesses that I know of, have and regularly conduct scenario planning and going through scenarios and picking up the learnings from it, because it's not until you go through it that you can come out the other end as best placed as you can. So a global financial crisis, a pandemic, one a little bit closer to home, but nonetheless traumatic. And the only other component to Phil's murder was, the care. And again, it sort of crept up on us, but you just knew you had to wrap your arms around a lot of people. And I can remember, made sure we were all together. You can't leave people in isolation, little learning. Be together where you can talk and listen, care for people. Had everyone at my place, all the players, partners, coaches. Everyone, backyard was full. Our local pizza bar made a fortune. I think Tex took control of the food, and I think we had 100 pizzas delivered. They could only do 10 at a time, Tim. So that was their capacity. But genuine care for people, no matter, regardless of what the crisis is paramount, and I think good leaders show that, and it's a message I'd love you to take away. This one, and I'll finish up very shortly, but less of a crisis, but nonetheless something that experience makes for a better outcome. I got into banking after Jeff gave me my opportunity. I worked for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. It was as a consequence of my 7th takeover. I've been taken over 7 times. I've always been the takeover, not the takeover E. You know what I mean, Phil? Probably never wanted to stay, always ended up staying, and glad I did. But 7 times. So the CBA took over this merged entity, which was comprised of a city mutual that had become a capita. There was a bunch of insurance companies. It was the State Bank of New South Wales. Remember when all the state banks collapsed? There's another crisis we could talk about. And they were all bolted into what was the Colonial Group, and the CBA took it out. Still Australia's largest, I think it was a $12 billion deal. So takeovers are traumatic for a lot of people. And I've seen, having done 7, been involved in 7, there's just some rules, no different to a crisis. And it starts again with communication and more communication. You must tell everybody involved in that, identify all the stakeholders and tell them what they can expect to the best of your ability. Once you've done that, then you've got to act. Then it's which culture do you adopt? And the CBA, who possibly had, not speaking out of school, maybe more a public service culture where you got promoted depending upon what your employee number was, which was dictated by your tenure. That's how you got promoted not that long ago. Anyone from the CBA here? And good. And but they took the considered opportunity to change their culture, and they went through all of the other companies that they'd taken over and picked out the best of the best in different areas and sort of parachuted them into all parts of the CBA. And it was a stroke of genius looking back, because they took an opportunity to change a culture. A bit like Virgin, who came into the Australian aviation. They started a culture. They were able to hire for a culture and worked out what they wanted, the behaviours they wanted exhibited, the tone in which they wanted to treat their customers, and they just did it. Whereas to change a culture takes you several years and a lot of dedication and a lot of hard work. But being taken over, Jeff, isn't a crisis. It's a trauma, and if you get it right, it delivers in spades for shareholders, which as businesses, we exist to make profits for our shareholders. It's in the Corporation Act. Don't be afraid to make money. And if you get it wrong though, it's earnings dilutive and it's a disaster. But pleased to say that over time was a very successful merger, and a lot of good things came out of that for shareholders. But look, I just wanted to share a couple of anecdotes, some learnings in there, I hope. Didn't go into any of the detail. I've taken some real shortcuts there, but I'll pause. Very happy to answer any questions that anyone may have. Denny. The old Ross Trevor sparring partner here.
Yes, we did discuss that earlier. We have time for 2 questions. So who would like to ask a question? I'm sure there'd be plenty.
Okay, so I'm an economist, and we have this quip that we successfully predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions. So what I would like to know is what is actually a crisis, and how do you kind of spot it? Like in a sense saying you kind of, okay, the pandemic is a crisis, but what do you actually think of makes something a crisis? And what does it change, whether it is a crisis or not?
I think a crisis is something that has the potential to seriously disrupt or derail what your current purpose is. And as I said earlier, it can disrupt a country, war, it can disrupt an industry, call it banking or football or whatever, or just in a personal, it can be very personal and it can be a crisis to you. I think it's self-defining a lot, but if it has the potential, let's say from a business perspective, to derail what you're doing and be earnings dilutive to all its shareholders and have a material impact, that's a crisis, I think.
My name is Laurie Lewis. I'm very interested in what's going to happen to our economy in the next 2 years. I think we're going to go through a crisis.
Yep.
I think we're going through a crisis.
Yep.
And I'd like an opinion of somebody with expert knowledge, not a bloke who's 82 years old, who doesn't know anything.
Look, crystal ball. Do you know what? I could paint 2 stories. Let's say I take a negative bookend. At a macroeconomic level, geopolitical level, there could be war between Taiwan and China, which will invariably involve trading partners in the world, and I would call that a crisis. And that has serious economic impacts, and serious economic impacts affects us all in our day-to-day living, cost of living, and may have for some time if our leaders in the world don't get this right. And a year ago, I was less optimistic about how that would play out. I'm a little bit more optimistic about how that plays out. No one knows more about China and its intents than our current governor, Francis Adamson, who was a former ambassador to China and lived there for a long time and knows the tone of what's being said and the meaning behind the words that are being said. So that would be one bookend. I can also paint a positive picture, and this is the one I'd like to believe, and that is that the interest rate cycle may have one more increase in it. If it does, I'm okay. And then given all of the government speak around the banks and the criticism of them raising interest rates to this level, which are not the 17 or 19% that I bought my first home in 1983, but I think interest rates would then come down just as quickly as they've gone up. Inflation figures were out yesterday, but 6%. Okay, I knew they were coming out, but I had dinner last night and haven't focused on it. But that doesn't surprise me. I think it can get under control. That's the biggest fear for me, more so than interest rates. If you get that under control, I think I could paint a picture of prosperity starting to emerge at the end of next year. Cycles come and go, and the older you get, the faster they come and go. When I was a youngster, you know, like 3-year cycle of high interest rates or rising interest rates was a long time. Now it's, you know, it's not quite a blip, but I can cope with it. But I think the most important thing is if we have a job, if everybody has a job, if they're employed and earning money, I think we're going to be okay. And I look at some countries that don't have that privilege of having full employment. Whilst we've got full employment, I think we can absorb higher interest rates. Government need to contain inflation. That's sort of their job. And I think I could paint a picture where maybe the second part of next year, we're coming out of that and we're starting to feel good about ourselves and starting to take a bit of pride in our economy and our industries, and particularly the emerging ones. And we might have a little period, a sustained period of economic prosperity. Somewhere in between, and I'm not an economist, but gee, I think I sounded like one because I didn't give you the answer.
Thank you so much, Rob, for that address. I thought it was absolutely sensational. I love listening to people that are talking from experience. You know, one of my mentors said, "Don't tell me, show me." And here's a gentleman that's walked the path. And also, I love the fact of his heart in terms of the way he cares about people. You know, people don't care what you know until they know how much you care. So thank you so much for giving up your valuable time to be here. Now let's be upstanding. Or before we do that, I must present Rob with our 100 Not Out magazine. And all the proceeds of today go to charity. So thanks very much for your address. Let's be upstanding and thank our...